In this lesson you will learn about steps, leaps, and the keyboard. As you watch the lecture, I would encourage you to pause the video to take notes, rewind to listen to material that may not have been clear at first, or fast forward through topics that you are comfortable with. After you've watched the videos, you can work through the practice exercises on Canvas. If you have any questions, post them to the discussion board. Feel free to answer your classmates' question on the discussion board as well, and the TAs and I will check in periodically to answer your questions. Make sure to do the practice exercises that are linked to, and to take the short quiz before coming to class. You're welcome to take it as many times as you like and to use whatever material you have handy, but you must score 100% in order for it to count. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to distinguish between steps and leaps, distinguish between whole and half steps, both diatonic and chromatic, write steps and or leaps above or below a given note, and to use the piano keyboard to illustrate steps and leaps. You'll recall the musical alphabet consists of the letters A through G. When we get to G, the names start over again with A. Two notes are considered a step apart if their letter names are adjacent in the musical alphabet. B and C are considered a step, F and E are considered a step, and G and A are considered a step apart. You can also visualize steps on a staff. Notes that are a step apart appear on a line and adjacent space, or a space and an adjacent line. Steps can be ascending or descending. Below are a few examples of steps of all kinds. Here's an ascending step from C to D. It's on a line and an adjacent space. Here's a descending step from E to D. It's on a space and an adjacent line. Here's an ascending step from B to C. Adjacent letter names, adjacent space, adjacent line, although notice here we've used ledger lines. And a descending step from G to F, a line and the adjacent space. Leaps are easy to define. Anything that is not a step is considered a leap. Leaps can also ascend or descend. Below are a few examples of leaps. Note in particular the last example, D and C. They're adjacent letter names, but they're not on an adjacent line and space. There's more than an octave between them, so that makes this a leap. Here is a piano keyboard. You'll recall from the previous lesson that there's a repeating pattern of 2 and 3 black keys, and that C is always the note immediately to the left of the 2 black keys. I've labeled all of the C's on this keyboard. The C's are all members of the same pitch class, but they are different pitches. You can see that they are all related by an octave. There are 8 white keys from C to C. On this slide, I've indicated some steps and some leaps. Like our earlier definition, steps are basically adjacent keys. Leaps are between any 2 non-adjacent keys. Here, I've labeled 3 notes, B, C, and D. B and C are a step apart, and C and D are a step apart. However, between C and D there is a black key, while there is no black key between B and C. This indicates that there are 2 different kinds or sizes of step. Half steps, which are also called semitones, are the distance between any 2 adjacent white keys where there is no black key in between. Whole steps are the distance between 2 adjacent white keys when there is a black key in between. Here is an illustration of half steps versus whole steps on the keyboard. Here there's no black key in between. Here there's 1 black key in between. We can think of the black keys as alterations of the notes on the white keys. In order to make these alterations, we need accidentals. Accidentals are used to raise or lower a note by a half step. They consist of sharps, which raise a note by a half step, flats, which lower a note by a half step, and naturals, which cancel out a sharp or a flat. Basic math suggests that we can add 2 half steps to get a whole step. The distance between any 2 adjacent keys, regardless of color, is a half step. On the left, it's a half step from C to C sharp, and a half step from C sharp to D. It's a whole step then from C to D. Thinking in the opposite direction, over here on the right, it's a half step from D down to D flat. It's a half step from D flat down to C. It is customary to use sharps when ascending and flats when descending. I will explain how one key can have 2 different names momentarily. Because we can add half steps to get a whole step, that expands the kinds of combinations we can find on the piano keyboard. For instance, from one black key to an adjacent black key is a whole step because there's one intervening key. I can go half step, and that gives me a whole step. From this white key to this black key is a whole step because I can go half step. That gives us a whole step. From this black key to this white key is also a whole step because I can go half step. Basically, the distance between any 2 keys on the piano keyboard is a half step, and you can add half steps together to get whole steps. Since we've thrown accidentals into the mix, we can now talk about 2 different kinds of half steps, diatonic and chromatic. Diatonic half steps have different letter names, for instance C and D flat, or F sharp and G. Chromatic half steps have the same letter name, for instance C and C sharp, or A and A flat. Accidentals also suggest that one key on the piano can have 2 different names. This is known as enharmonic equivalence. 2 notes are enharmonically equivalent if they're spelled differently but sound the same. Put another way, they're played with the same key on the keyboard. B and C flat are examples of enharmonically spelled notes. For instance, this is B, and if I take C and I lower it by a half step, it's the same button. E sharp and F are the same key. Here's F, and if I take E and I raise it by a half step, it becomes F. And B flat and A sharp are the same. If I take A and I raise it by a half step, and I take B and I lower it by a half step, it gives me the same key. So those are enharmonically equivalent notes. You should now be able to distinguish between steps and leaps, between whole and half steps, both diatonic and chromatic. You should be able to write steps and or leaps above or below a given note, and you should be able to use the piano keyboard to illustrate steps and leaps. Feel free to watch all or part of this video again. It's very important that you know this material before coming to class because we'll not take time in class to go over it. Work through the practice exercises on Canvas and post any questions you might have to the discussion board. Feel free to answer your classmates' questions, and the TAs and I will check in periodically to answer anything that's left unanswered. Take the short quiz before coming to class. You're welcome to take it as many times as you'd like, and you can use whatever you have nearby, but you must score 100% on the quiz in order for it to count.